بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. My name is Hisham Al-Talib and we are speaking from the IIIT. We have this webinar titled Islamic Finance in Practice with Dr. Michael McMillen. When IIIT was established in 1981, we diagnosed the problem of the Muslim Ummah as having divided into two camps, the secularist and the traditionalist. Neither camp succeeded in reviving the Ummah and solving the problems and starting the Islamic civilization again as it is supposed to do. So the problem we diagnosed was blind imitation of the West, or blind imitation of the Islamic history, because those traditionalists, they wanted to implant the history back into today's work. This doesn't work. As the Prophet told us, this blind imitation will not get us anywhere. We have to be original, creative, thinking of the original resources of the revelation, as well as the human achievements all over the history, whether they are Western, Eastern, Indian, Chinese, European, American, Muslims. All this has to be taken into consideration. So IIIT from the beginning was interested in this Islamic banking, financing, the halal transactions, and all of it since the 70s up to now. We have done many things, seminars, institutions, transactions, major international conferences and so on. And briefly speaking, our former president, Dr. Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman, rahmatullahi alayhi, from Mecca, he used to say, unfortunately, the Muslims today, when they want to address these issues, they cut and paste. They quote Western and Eastern solutions and start them with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and end them with Sadaqallahu al-Azim, and think they have created an Islamic finance or Islamic social work, social psychology, etc., etc. So today, I found the perfect example of original thinking, creative research in the Islamic law sources of the Quran and the Sunnah, as well as the capitalism, socialism, communism, all the liberalism, all the isms of the world. And we have here the pioneer with us. I call him MM&M, Dr. Michael McMillen. Briefly speaking, McMillen is a partner of Curtis, Mallet, Prevost, Colt, and Mossel LLP. MashaAllah, so many titles. Michael is internationally recognized for his work in Islamic finance and project finance. His transactional work focuses on the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. He publishes and speaks throughout the world on Islamic finance and the project and infrastructure finance. He has twice been a recipient of the Euro Money Award for Best Legal Advisor in Islamic Finance from 2004 and 2007. And has also received the Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum Award for Best Legal Advisor in Islamic Finance for North America. He twice served as chair and was the founding chair of the Islamic Law Section, a division of the International Law Section of the American Bar Association. Michael serves on the editorial board of the Arab Law Quarterly and has also been active in the capital market initiatives on the Islamic Finance Services Board, focusing on securities and capital markets laws, the use of trust and the trust concepts in capital markets transactions, and the enforceability of the sharia in different jurisdictions throughout the world. He will speak for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A for another 20 minutes. And I am really looking forward to learn on this pioneer, original, creative thinker who has combined the revelation as well as the experience, human experience, East and West, in the solutions of this big issue Islamic finance in practice. Please start, Mr. M, and M.
I thank you, Dr. Hisham. Appreciate that. And first, let me thank everybody at IIT and the Fairfax Institute for arranging this and all of you that are attending. I'm going to kind of speak to 4 issues today. Why Islamic finance? What is Islamic finance? Some constraints and challenges. And the reason I focus on those is more to get to the responses to the constraints and challenges, and a few opportunities. Why Islamic finance? Well, obviously, to allow Muslims to conduct their financial activities in accordance with their religious, moral, and ethical beliefs. From an academic vantage, Islamic finance since the 1970s and post-World War II is an excellent example of the accommodation of law to different systems and the evolution of law. Probably, from my vantage, the best way to think about it, the why, is to think about the history. The devolution of the Islamic states after World War II. The first foci were on Sharia compliance in governance. Very quickly, there was a turn to Sharia compliant financial systems because, of course, you need financial systems. 1970s, it was mostly the deposit side of Islamic banking. Most of the focus, Egyptian banks, Dubai Islamic Bank, Islamic Development Bank, and others. A few have survived, many have not. Then you came to the mid-1990s and the focus shifted. From the mid-1990s to the present, while retaining Islamic banking as a focus, there was an increased focus on the investment and finance side of Islamic finance. A good part of that has been the adaptation of nominate contracts, ancient contracts, the few dozen contracts that there are, to modern economic and financial systems. Some of that is replication and criticized as such, replication of Western. Some is accommodation and trying to build in harmony with existing systems. And we'll talk about that a little bit because that's the major constraint, is that the existing systems around the world aren't going to go away, and they're interest-based in almost every particular. The idea throughout here, as we talk about this, is how do we, because I'm going to focus more on the West, the US in particular, a little bit on others, and if people have questions, we can do others, but using the US as the example. It's rarely discussed in the literature. It's a huge market, the US market, Islamic finance market. The focus is how do we achieve a level playing field? How do we compete? So what is Islamic finance? I think of it as 4 categories: banking, finance, investment, and takaful, insurance. There's very little takaful in the US, and frankly, there's very little globally. There's some, it's mostly family takaful, the equivalent of life insurance. The closest equivalent in the United States are the mutual insurance companies. And often when we do transactions in the US, we will try and use mutual insurance companies where we can. But that's a small part. Banking, there are no Islamic banks in the United States, obviously. There are some in England. There are many in predominantly Muslim jurisdictions. How do we do Islamic finance in the United States using existing banking and finance capabilities? Many banks in the United States provide Islamic financing alternatives, not on the deposit side, but on the finance side. Finance is enabling economic activities, providing funds for economic growth and investment. Since the mid-1990s, finance and investment have been the focus, particularly in the US. And I'll just say, we'll come back to this. The amount of Islamic investment in the United States, Sharia compliant investment, is huge. And it's in every state. We'll come back to it, but real estate funds, we've done them in Sharia compliant real estate transactions in every single state. In the United States, Sharia compliant investment and finance is focused on two things, really: predominantly real estate investments, and secondarily private equity. And of course, because there's investment, there's a need for financing. So I don't know exactly how many, but over 200, possibly close to 300 US banks have participated in Sharia compliant transactions. Little tiny local banks, large banks. The first US bank probably was Key Bank, that provided some financing. At one point, ING was the largest, but you get a lot of small bank and trusts too, because real estate construction financing is not done by the big national banks. It's done by small local banks. So if you look at Sacramento, California, all those malls and apartments around the capital are Sharia compliant projects that were financed by Roseville Bank and Trust in Roseville, California. There have been a couple sukuk in the United States, but very few. I view that as really unfortunate. I'll kind of close with some observations on sukuk in the United States. But there have been a couple. East Cameron Oil and Gas sukuk, Goldman Sachs did a sukuk issuance from the US, but not very many, even though globally sukuk is the largest part of the market right now. The real estate began in the mid 1990s. United Bank of Kuwait was very active and sought some regulatory clearances for home purchases. The real activity began around 1999 up to around 2002, the starting period, which was residential real estate investing. You might recall the hurricanes in Florida. A lot of the condominiums that were rebuilt during that period were financed with Sharia compliant arrangements. Gated communities, golf course communities, multifamily housing, a very residential focus in those early years. The reason was related to the Dow Jones fatwa, if you know what that is. If not, we're going to deal with it in just a moment. But the Dow Jones fatwa addressed equity investing, but it established some principles that kind of flowed out into all areas of Islamic finance. In real estate, if you are a Sharia compliant owner, investor in a building, your tenants have to be in Sharia compliant businesses. So you can't have liquor stores as tenants, for example, and the entire list of prohibited activities. The Dow Jones fatwa addressed those activities in part. Until the Dow Jones fatwa was issued in 1998, people were focused on residential and stayed away from business tenants. So there was very limited commercial real estate until the Dow Jones principles kind of worked were worked out a little bit, which occurred from, well, Dow Jones started using their system in 99, and that went to about 2000. European real estate came 2003 and thereafter. So oddly enough, the United States was, and we'll discuss this a little bit, was a real leader in developing structures, rarely written about. But let's take real estate. Some of the properties that were involved, the Cargill, if you know what Cargill is, a huge trading company in Minnetonka, Minnesota, their headquarters we owned in a Sharia compliant fund, and we lease it back to them. The ExxonMobil headquarters in Houston, the FBI building in Denver is a Sharia compliant arrangement that's leased back to the FBI and the US government. Thomson Reuters headquarters in Boston, many Kohl's stores, and many, many other commercial activities. but some very prominent businesses. And of course, many businesses don't want to own their real estate. It's not tax advantage to own real estate if you're a business, because it's 30-year straight line depreciation and limited tax benefits. So they'll often sell their buildings and then lease them back. And we were very active, Sharia compliant funds, as we, in my instance here, in buying buildings and leasing them back to corporate entities and other businesses. On the private equity side, our Capita, which used to be First Islamic Investment Bank, Gulf Investment House, were leaders in that same period. Water sports activities, computer software, Caribou Coffee, Prologis warehouses, virtually all the Sunrise nursing homes in the United States, Loehmann's Clothing. There's a long list of companies that very few people realize were Sharia compliant transactions of different types. This all goes back to around 2000 and thereafter. Why the United States? Well, it's an incredibly diverse, stable, and predictable environment. The economy is diverse, lots of businesses. You can get geographic diversity. You can get industrial diversity by varying your tenants. A lot of activity. This legal system is stable. The economic system is on the whole stable. What happened here? Well, two things. For the first time, we had to focus on tax in harmony with the Sharia. Sharia first and foremost, but how do you get money into the United States and out without taxation or with minimal taxation? When you're in the United States, how do you get tax advantaged investments? Those were the kinds of problems. We'll comment on it briefly. The device that was chosen was a lease, an ijara. And there were lots of reasons. If you look at a picture of a diagram of an ijara transaction, it looks the same as a leverage lease. Everybody in America in the finance world is familiar with a leverage lease. So it was relatively easy to go to the banking community and say, will you do this kind of transaction? At first, we went and said, will you do a Sharia compliant transaction? And people looked at us like we were out of our minds. When we dropped the Sharia compliance in the first sentence and said, will you do this transaction, and showed them a picture, they said, of course, we do those transactions all the time. And then you mentioned that it's Sharia compliant a little later. And we've induced an awful lot of banks to participate in transactions. They're not troubled. It's just a lease financing to them. The primary consideration at the beginning, as I mentioned, was permissible business activities, your tenants. Who are your tenants? And some of that puts Sharia compliant deals at a disadvantage on the playing field that we can never overcome, because we can't release properties to whole segments of the economy. So always we're a little disadvantaged. So our goal at all times is, how do we get the level playing field? And that usually works through the tax system, which kind of brings me to the constraints. And I want to begin here with Dow Jones. Dow Jones was trying to build an equity index. That began around 1993. A fellow named Rushdie Siddiqui was at Dow Jones at the time and worked for years and years on this. Sharia board began considering that fatwa in 1993. It took 5 years to get the fatwa issued. It was issued in 98 and implemented in 99. The idea here was, how do you develop the equity side of the Islamic capital markets? There's an equity side and a debt side. The sukuk are the debt side, if you will, and how do you develop the equity side? If you kind of put yourself back into 1998, if you can, if you were a devout Muslim, could you purchase an equity anywhere in the world? And basically the answer was no. There are few purely Sharia compliant equities, but most companies pay or receive interest in some aspect of their business, or they're engaged in some impermissible business activity. Take General Electric or Ford Motor or somebody like that. They all have credit companies. Take Ford. Ford has a credit company that they use to sell cars, trucks, and satellites and whatnot. It's interest-based finance. So basically, you could never buy a share of stock. Well, that won't work. If you're going to try and build an Islamic economy, you need to have an equity side of the capital markets. So the Dow Jones fatwa addressed this set of problems. And it took a long, long time, 5 years, to get some consensus on this. The consensus came in the form of 3 tiers of tests. Basically, the fatwa did 2 things. It allows some impurity or variance, depending on how you want to describe it. But the types of tests, and they are now, by the way, used all over the world. This was a huge contribution to Islamic finance around the world. There were 3 levels, and this is a non-controlling investment. People who are buying shares of stock in corporate entities. Let's begin with listed entities. It goes beyond that. It goes to any non-controlling interest. If you take a controlling interest, you have to make the whole entity entirely Sharia compliant. You don't get the advantage of the variance or impurity. If you take a non-controlling interest, however, the fatwa says you go through 3 levels of tests. First is the instrument itself, Sharia compliant. So for example, preferred stock, most scholars will not allow you to purchase preferred stock because it has a preference. Somebody gets paid preferentially under most preferred stock arrangements, and that's contrary to some Sharia principles. The fatwa itself, and this is a lesson to be learned, says you cannot have fixed income instruments. Well, since the fatwa was written, we've developed lots of Sharia compliant fixed income instruments. The easiest to imagine is a fixed rate lease. It becomes a fixed rate instrument that is entirely Sharia compliant if done properly. So don't take it too literally when you read the fatwa. The principle is the risk reward system that's embodied in the Sharia has to be adhered to. Preferred stock does not comply with that. If you get through that set of inquiries, you ask, is the business activity of the entity permissible? And here it gets a little more nuanced. The reaction is, well, you can't have anything to do with alcohol, which turns out to be not true in the great many cases. If you're talking about alcohol that's used as a solvent for cleaning grease on gears, most Sharia scholars won't object to that. It's alcohol for human consumption. That's the issue. Well, this goes through, as you think of different aspects of activities that are prohibited, the discussions get quite nuanced. What are you looking at actually? For example, the Dow Jones fatwa says you can't have any entertainment stocks in your portfolio, and you can't make an investment in an entertainment stock. Is that literally true? Most Sharia scholars say no, it's not literally true. There are some entertainment stocks that are permissible. But there was a burden of proof built into the fatwa to say to somebody, if you want to buy an entertainment stock, you have to come to the Sharia board and demonstrate to us that this is Sharia compliant. Because many movie productions, enterprises produce obscene or pornographic material of some sort. So there's a series of burden of proof elements built into the fatwa. But was there an objection to Mickey Mouse as an entertainment concept? No, there wasn't. Certain theaters, for example, AMC, won't show objectionable films. So Sharia scholars will generally allow financings of malls that include an AMC theater where they would not for other theater chains. So you get into a great deal of really nuanced thinking. The first test of the Dow Jones fatwa was a 4-story building that had an ATM machine on the first floor that was owned by a US interest-based bank. There was no banking activity other than that machine. Now we're going back to 2000 here. Was that objectionable? It was determined it was not, because there are no Islamic banks in the United States. People need to do banking activities. There was no lending going on. The activity of ATMs, of course, has changed quite a bit since then. If you can borrow through your ATM, the Sharia scholars might take a very different view of that ATM. We went through amazing progression. And I would say I've done Islamic finance work since 1996. I would say that probably 7 to 12 times a week, I'm addressing some issue of Sharia compliant business activities. The focus of Dow Jones at the time, the Sharia board, was conglomerates at one level. The Ford Motor Company example. Can you buy a share of stock in Ford Motor Company? They own a credit company. In many of those instances, the determination was that you could buy the share of stock because the impermissible activity wasn't a primary business activity and didn't contribute in a major way to the income of the overall entity. And we'll get to the cure for all that, of course, which you probably are aware of, but purification or cleansing. If you can identify impure income, you have to give it away. So if you can identify what portion of the dividend from Ford Motor stock is attributable to interest or other impure sources, you're going to have to give it away. And there are lots of different mechanisms in the industry for doing that. All right, so the Dow Jones fatwa, it kind of institutionalized the concept of variance. Applying that to real estate, take my example of the ATM. They said, okay, we're going to allow that little bit of variance. It's a tiny space. You can buy the building. When you take this problem to a larger, let's say you buy an office building or 4 office buildings in the middle of Indiana, and one of them has a restaurant that serves alcohol. There's no place else for the people in those 4 offices to eat within driving distance. They can't go for lunch, eat, and get back. That sort of arrangement has been approved, but then you have to determine how much of the income of that restaurant is attributable to alcohol sales and give that away. Well, that's difficult because they're not going to tell you how much. You can go to Washington. There are trade groups, and you can get pretty accurate figures in the United States to make that determination. Most Sharia compliant investors will err on the conservative side and say, well, I'm just going to give away all the profit from that lease, rather than trying to cut it down. How much is alcohol related? How much isn't? In some instances, you will try and cut it down. You'll try and make that differentiation. In some, you'll just take the conservative point of view and say, I don't want anything to do with that income. So there are lots of different approaches to how you resolve that. Other constraints. Well, Western jurisdictions are interest-based. How do you measure risk? It's an interest rate function. How do you measure returns or payments? What's a bank? If you look at legal definitions of banking, usually it's tied in some fashion to making a loan, and a loan at interest. How do you get money out of the United States without paying tax? Well, there's really one way. It's called portfolio interest. If you take an interest-bearing loan, and it has to be an interest-bearing loan from offshore, and it's not, a regular trade or business activity, and you repay that interest, there's no tax on the repayment of the interest. There's no tax on the repayment of the principal. The whole tax system in most Western jurisdictions is built on taxing interest, not principal. If you take a loan, the bank gets taxed on its interest income, not the repayment of the principal. This will illustrate to you, that little example, a disadvantage for us in the Islamic finance industry. If we substitute rent for a loan, we're going to get taxed on 100% of the rent payment, which includes, if you analogize, both principal and interest. So we're being taxed on our principal, whereas the conventional entity is only being taxed on interest. We're at a big disadvantage. When I say create a level playing field, this is one of the things, the down and dirty of implementing Islamic finance is figuring out how we equilibrate, how we get a level playing field in a jurisdiction that's biased in favor of interest-based concepts. And we spent a lot of time in the early years doing that. Think also of what's equity, what's debt? How do you make the determination? Well, if there's interest, it's debt. The distinctions everywhere are interest-based. You bump into it everywhere you turn. So we have to deal with this in lots of different ways. Underwriting determinations are all interest-based. The regulatory framework, what's a bank? You're lending at interest. What's a financing activity? You're lending at interest. The legal determinations, usury, damage concepts, return concepts, market rates, are all geared to interest. And we had to face this in the 1990s and figure out, okay, we're not going to be able to change this system. There's just no way that's going to happen. So how do we get on a level playing field? And we spent a lot of time in the early noughts figuring out how to do that. Well, what's a profit rate? It's kind of the same as an interest rate in the sense that it's a rate of return that will induce you to participate in some activity. And that's an interest rate as well. There are differences, obviously. And there are risk allocations but it's inducement and how you measure risk. For those of you who know who Mufti Taqi Usmani once told me, he said, look, in terms of reference rates, a rate is just a measure of risk. If you want to use interest rates, that's okay. You can't charge interest. And he said, let me make the point this way. If you think the price of whiskey measures risk in that environment that you're looking at, you can use the price of whiskey as your reference. You can't sell the whiskey, you can't drink it. It's just a number. It's an unseemly thing to do to use that particular, but it's not contrary to the Sharia. It's just a number. And if you think the price of whiskey measures risk in that economy or that situation, it would be okay to use it. I've never seen anybody do that, but obviously, that was his point. Most of the contracts that are used, what are called nominate contracts, that are used in Islamic finance are either sale-based or partnership-based. Sales get taxed differently. They get taxed on 100% of the price if you're talking about VAT or sales tax or something like that. You may only get taxed on 100 on the profit in certain aspects, but the point is they get taxed. And what we can use are sales. Murabaha, most people are familiar with, cost plus sale, which is the most frequently abused, most frequently used device there is. But ijara, what's an ijara? A lease. It's a sale. It's a sale of a usufruct. Under the Sharia, this is a bit of a difference. You don't think in a Western lawyer or financier does not think their knee-jerk reaction isn't to think of a lease as a sale. The knee-jerk reaction of somebody who knows something about the Sharia is it's a sale. There are tax disadvantages to that. Rent is taxed for both the principal component and the interest component. So again, we need to achieve a level playing field. What happened in the United States? Well, the United States, in my view, is one of the most supportive of Islamic finance in the world. 1997, 1999, the United Bank of Kuwait, Abdul Qadir Thomas was there at the time, we got two interpretive letters from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency saying that a lease and a murabaha in different home purchase contexts and equipment financing contexts are the equivalent of loans. Well, this is brilliant. All of a sudden, we're not going to get taxed on the whole rent. We're going to get taxed on the profit amount, which may be very close to the interest rate in an interest-based financing. New York State in 2008 said a lease is not taxable as a sale, it's a loan in this context. Well, what does all this mean? We're on a level playing field. We can compete. Secondly, what it allowed any conventional bank in the United States or any financing company in the United States that wants to do Sharia compliant financing can do so because it's characterized as a loan. Well, this is brilliant. This allows banks to participate across the country. And it's helped us a lot in advancing Islamic finance across the US. May also surprise you to learn, and some of you may know, but the Federal Reserve Board of New York has had an Islamic banking group for, I don't know, 15 years or more. Tom Baxter, who's the general counsel there, and also the general counsel of the Federal Open Market Committee, took an interest in Islamic banking and was preparing to issue an Islamic banking license, trying to learn a lot about it and how do we do it. Now, the reality is in the United States, you'd never start a new bank. It's just way too difficult and too expensive. What you do is you go buy a bankrupt bank and you reshape it if you want to start a new bank. But it tells you, Tom and the group were very interested in Islamic banking and in preparing for that, and they investigated it at length. The other aspect, another accommodation to the constraints in the United States, and I may actually show you a slide here, was what I call a bifurcated lease structure. This is a lease that can be used in this jurisdiction, the United States, with conventional banks so that they can make an interest-bearing loan to an entity in a Sharia compliant deal. Or a food wholesaler can finance inventory for halal products, for example, foods. It's used everywhere. It is now the standard throughout the world. This was really interesting. This happened in 2000, 99, 2000, we started doing this. It took a while to refine it for tax and regulatory considerations. And this is kind of where I started and said, if you show them a picture of a lease, everybody says, oh, I'll do that. We do that all the time. It's how you do real estate transactions in the US, Sharia compliant real estate in the US. It's how you do Sharia compliant private equity. Related to that, the money comes in to the United States through what I mentioned as the portfolio interest exemption to taxation. That has to be a loan, and it has to be an interest-bearing loan. And that's built into all these structures because most of these investments were foreign money coming into the United States. US Muslims have done almost no investing relatively in Sharia compliant matters. Very, very small, and I hope that will change. I'm working on 4 or 5 transactions right now that are only for US investors. This is a very hopeful sign to me, but so our first focus was all on foreign money coming in. And the way we did that, by the way, is to set up ownership structures where the Sharia compliant investor owned equity and 1 share of equity and 1 share of debt, or however many shares, in 2 different entities, one of whom made an equity contribution, the other one made a loan, a portfolio interest loan. If the investor owns both, under the interpretations of almost all Sharia scholars, it's self-lending. You own the equity in the company to which you made an interest-bearing loan. Paying yourself interest is okay. And that passes muster for US tax. Why did we pick a lease? Because every financier, every lawyer knows what a lease financing is. It's familiar. We have underwriting experience with it. We have lots of litigation experience. New York courts are very, very conversant with lease financings. We have bankruptcy experience. We have regulatory experience. So it was the easiest sell. And it happens that a Sharia compliant lease and a finance lease in the US are very, very similar. There are very few differences. There are some, and you have to adjust for that. Let me see if I can show very quickly. I think the host disabled my screen sharing, so I can't show the slide unless somebody could allow me to do that. So maybe Lynn or IT.
Please try now.
Okay. Nope, that's not the one I want, right? Let me try it again. Okay. Are you seeing my desktop, or are you seeing a picture? Do you see a transactional diagram, or do you see a whole bunch of stuff on my desktop?
Oh, hi, Michael. I'm looking at your PowerPoint right now.
Okay, great.
Yes, we see it. Yes, doctor, we see it.
Okay, this is a bifurcated lease structure that's used in the US, and it happens to be used in entirely Sharia compliant jurisdictions, Muslim jurisdictions as well. A bank makes a conventional loan to a funding company. What that does is preserve the bank's documentation and its underwriting processes and all its regulatory process. They get to use the same documents they would always use. That funding company buys the building or the real estate and leases it to the project company over on the right side. And you see in the middle the rent payable from the project company to the funding company. That money is derived from the tenants in the building. So there's a lease and a sublease down to the occupational tenants. The tenants pay rent. You take some of that money. The project company takes some of that money and pays it to the funding company. How much? Well, to the penny, the amount that you're going to pay the bank on its debt service. So whatever the bank financing is, that's how much rent is. Everything on the right side of that dotted line is Sharia compliant. Everything on the left side is not. This structure is used everywhere in the world at this point. The United States is the only country in the world that allows you to check what's called check the box on your taxes on a company. The funding company is a check the box entity, which means It's disregarded for tax purposes. It's not there to the Internal Revenue Service. That allows us to comply with the regulatory requirements that says this whole arrangement is a loan for US banking and tax purposes. Even though clearly for Sharia purposes, it's a lease. The United States is the only country in the world that I'm aware of that has disregarded entities of this type. In Europe or someplace, that rent is going to be taxed going into the funding company. And you have to, it's a make-work project for lawyers. It sends my kids to college. You hire lawyers to figure out how to not pay tax on that money. But societal waste, the only people who make any money on it are the lawyers figuring that out. In the United States, you don't have to do that. So we have a tax matters agreement that says for US federal income tax purposes, this is really a loan from the bank to the project company. And you tell the Internal Revenue Service exactly how it works. Well, that structure was developed in the US. It's everywhere at this point. One other constraint, and then we'll have just 2 minutes on opportunities and be done here. Bankruptcy. The United States is a jurisdiction where we, and the title of the act includes the concept, we reorganize entities. Whereas in many jurisdictions, England, what they do is liquidate assets and pay creditors. In the United States, we give people another chance. For those of you who are familiar with IFLAS, bankruptcy concepts, under the Sharia, they are much more like the United States. So many Sharia scholars send people to the United States in bankruptcy situations. The two major bankruptcies that have been done in the United States for Sharia compliant transactions or companies are the East Cameron Oil and Gas Sukuk and our Capita. In both of those, the US bankruptcy courts and all the other courts involved allowed Sharia compliant financings to effect the reorganization. So we did Murabaha financings for the debtor in possession financings during the course of the bankruptcy. All of those Sharia compliant mechanisms were approved by the US bankruptcy courts. That's why I say the US has been amazingly supportive and helpful in advancing Islamic finance. So what are the opportunities? I'll give you one example, and then I'll make 2 or 3 sentences of comments. I think probably the largest opportunity, not the only one by any means, are sukuk. Securitizations were developed in the United States. Nobody has more experience. What is a sukuk? It's not a bond, despite the fact that we all call them Islamic bonds. They aren't bonds. They're securitizations. If you're going to do sukuk that are outside the United States, you basically can't get a private sector sukuk rated. You might be able to in Europe in a couple spots, but in the Middle East, you can't. Why? Because the bankruptcy and insolvency laws are not well enough developed. The rating agencies won't give you a rating on a private sector. They will rate government sukuk issuances, but then they rate on the government credit criteria, not true sale, bankruptcy law, non-consolidation, all these magical things that securitization lawyers and bankruptcy lawyers worry about. In the United States, we do private sector securitizations constantly, and we have just a plethora of assets that could be Sharia compliant assets that can be securitized. We need to do this. Islamic banks around the world cannot get enough tier 1 and 2 tier 2 capital for their regulatory purposes. How do you do that? Securitize assets in the United States, make them tier 1, tier 2 compliant. Let the Islamic banks hold on to them. They need those assets. I think this is an enormous opportunity. I wish people would take it up. It's relatively easy. We're expert at doing securitizations. We did some experiments, and if we did some Sharia compliant instruments and didn't say they were Sharia compliant. We just said they're trust certificates. They're all Sharia compliant. US investors don't care. Who buys Sukuk, government Sukuk now? US pension funds buy almost half of them, or so I'm told. They're match funding against their pension payment obligations. They don't care if it's Sharia compliant or not. So if you want to build the debt side of the capital markets and you want to have tier compliant capital, this is a good way to do it. In many other areas, investments in US assets, the number of Sharia compliant assets is virtually unlimited. It would be easy. We can get them rated. The weakness in our system thus far is that US Muslims don't do Sharia compliant investing. It's not their fault. There just haven't been a lot of instruments sold to them. That is changing. As I said, I'm doing 4 or 5 of them right now that are only for US Muslim population. They will not be sold internationally. And we've done a couple in the last couple of years. They're relatively easy to do. They were more difficult to do at the beginning because the transaction costs were so high. Until you develop the structure and the way to do it, the transaction costs were very high and too high for a small US offering. That's no longer true. So I'm hopeful that this is a trend that will continue as well. And that's all I have. People have questions, I'm happy to deal with them. And if later anybody wants to go into more detail about many of these things, I'm happy to always to talk and respond and direct people.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Michael McMillen. You reminded me of our effort in 1982 and the difficulties to encounter in this kind of subject, Islamic financing, banking, and so on. Myself, Dr. Jamal Barzanchi, rahmatullahi alayh, Dr. Muhammad Shamma, with some lawyers and investors, we went to Geneva, Switzerland, asking them, trying, and we stayed 3-4 days meeting different experts and lawyers and bankers and so on to register an Islamic bank. So they tell us, what do you want? We said, we want a bank without interest. Then all of them, it's like, cliche. A bank is an interest institution. Why are you insisting on this word bank? Make any other, we can, write you any other investment company, this, that, institution, society, whatever. We have lots of them, but just don't call it a bank. We said, no, thank you. Shukran jazilan. We went back to the United States and we tabled this until later. Now, I must admit, I benefit so much from this short lecture. It's full of beef. It is, especially, it was focused on practical things and practical examples. And this is what I love. Dr. McMillen, we have so many questions. I wish we can deal with them all, which is impossible, I know. But please help us all to answer them quickly so that we can have, the quicker you answer, the faster we can get to many other questions. Thank you again. The first question, who issued the Dow Jones fatwa? Has there been any revisions or updates to this fatwa? Please go ahead.
Okay, there were 5 scholars on the Sharia board. The Sharia board was comprised by Dow Jones, Taki Usmani, Yusuf Talal Di Lorenzo, Mohammed Al-Ghari, Nizam Yakubi, somebody else, I'm forgetting who.
Okay.
But there were 5 scholars. There are variations Since then, AOFI had changed it a little bit. The Dow Jones fatwa dealt with riba. It did not deal with impure income of other types. So riba being interest. It did not deal with impure income from, finance, let's say alcohol. You wouldn't have it, but other sources of impure income. But yes, there have been variations. There are many variations. But the big indices and funds tend to use the Dow Jones fatwa or something very similar. But there are local variations. For example, in Malaysia, there are 3 categories that are used. They have a higher tolerance for the tourism industry, so they allow hotels to sell more alcohol in the tourist business, for example. And there are local variations. That is part of Islam, that there are local variations in all kinds of principles. There are in the fatwa for equity investing as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question. What are the conditions needed to establish an Islamic financial system? What needs to be in place?
Boy, there is a question. Well, the approach that was taken by scholars from, think of this in Islam. There was a period of hundreds of years where there was no Islamic finance. Interest-based colonialism took over the world. And so the people who were interested in the Sharia as it applied to commerce were mostly in academic institutions for a long, long time. In the 1970s, when they were trying to form banks, the people who were trying to form the banks went to the academics. And it's interesting to talk to the older scholars who describe what happened. They didn't know anything about it. They had a lot of theoretical knowledge, but they had no practical knowledge. And they said, yeah, I know in theory what's supposed to happen, but I have no idea how to really do it in practice. It hasn't been done for an awfully long time. And they kind of jokingly say, so I'm going to call my friend, another Sharia scholar in another academic institution. And so as is part of the long history of Islam, there's a lot of collaboration. And they were trying to say, okay, how do you form an Islamic economy? Well, there's lots about governance. We're just talking about finance. They began with the deposit side of banking. Well, then what do you do with the money once you get it? You can have the Al-Raji model back then was you don't pay people returns. It's safekeeping, amana concepts. And that wasn't very satisfactory because people were going to the interest-based competitors. They wanted returns on their money. Safekeeping wasn't enough. So you had to figure out, how do you get returns? The Mudaraba model became the predominant model. A Mudaraba is a service capital partnership. The bank performs a service. As the Mudarab, the Rabal Mal are the so-called depositors who bring their money. And the Mudarab invests it and they share the profits. That's the predominant return model. Let me back up on answering the question. What the scholars and people, business people, and that were interested in developing an Islamic economic system decided is you got to have an equity side of the capital markets. You have to have a financial institutions backbone, banks, financing companies. You got to have a equity side and a debt side. And that's what they've been working on. How do you finance things? Equity and debt. And we're trying to refine products as we go along and mechanisms. Until the mid-1990s, each nominate contract, so Murabaha, Ijara, Mudaraba, Musharaka, Arbun, whatever you have, they were all silos. You could only use one in a transaction, and it had to fit perfectly. In my view, one of the main developments of the mid-1990s is the scholars said, well, no, you can use more than one contract in a transaction as long as you don't defeat the purpose of either one. That was so revolutionary, I can't tell you, because now you can compete with Western products. It doesn't sound like much. It was a game changer in 1996.
Wow.
Now we can develop products that compete with conventional products. And I'm going to say something that people think is a little controversial sometimes. There is a lot of mimicry of Western finance concepts. I have this discussion with Sharia scholars all the time, and I think many of them share my view on this. If something works and it is not contrary to the Sharia, so what if you're copying it? Yeah, there are going to be some things that are pretty much the same. Human beings do business in the same way, whether they're Muslim or Jewish or Catholic or Buddhist, it doesn't matter. Many of the systems have evolved the same mechanisms for addressing risk. Now, just because it mimics is not condemnation in my view. It might be, but you got to dig in.
And I think that was the main contribution, the way I understand from you. Dig in, and go to the sources and people and, find the answers. Okay, another question, Doctor. What are the main challenges you face during this type of work in the US?
Remarkably few. I'll give you some examples. There are some situations post 9/11 in particular. I'm going to give you an example that was close after 9/11. Things got very tense. We used to advertise, if people know what a tombstone is, when you complete a financial transaction in the old days, and in many areas still, you publish what's called a tombstone. It's a little summary of the transaction. It's an advertisement, really. We quit doing tombstones on Sharia compliant deals for a while because of the just controversy surrounding 9/11. At that time, we were setting up for a Middle Eastern institution, we were setting up funds that invested in medical office buildings and related hospitals. Well, many hospitals, and this was across the US and Canada, all over, we probably did 30 or 40 of them in quick succession. Hospitals are often owned in part by a community. And they have tax exempt financing on them. Well, one of the things that we've never been able to get any change in is tax exempt financing. It's a very formulaic business, largely because the legislation dictates so many of the requirements. So you don't have a lot of room to move to change anything. We were doing transactions that had tax exempt financing on it, and it restricted us a great deal. The local ownership after 9/11 caused us to rethink some things. We developed new structures because if there's community ownership of a hospital, you may have to go through a public hearing. And we didn't want to go into public hearings in Bellevue, Washington, or someplace and say, this is a Sharia compliant deal. Don't be alarmed. It just going through a hearing like that was not going to be a beneficial exercise at that point. So we developed structures. We didn't hide it, but we developed structures that avoided all that sort of thing. That was an inconvenience. The biggest challenges were tax, though. Things like that, regulatory, getting the regulators. And now we don't have problems with that in the US. Banks are pretty willing to do these transactions. As I said, you don't necessarily tell them it's Sharia compliant in the first 5 minutes. You show them the structure and say, will you do this financing structure? But most people aren't afraid of it anymore. Look, fear of the unknown is always the bugaboo, right? I mean, so you have to find a way to say, this isn't scary. Let me tell you how we did it on the first one. This is kind of interesting to me. And this was before spreadsheets had unlimited number of cells. On one axis of a spreadsheet, we put every single provision of a loan agreement, a mortgage, a security document, hundreds and hundreds of lines from a conventional interest-bearing loan. On the other axis, we put the equivalent from an Ijara transaction and all the related documents. The purpose was where it was exactly the same risk allocation, it was black X. Where it was different, we put a red X so that we could show underwriting committees how few differences there really are. It was an extraordinarily costly exercise. Gulf Investment House, one guy there approved that expenditure to do it, to get one of the first deals done in the US. And as soon as they looked at this and they spot checked it, of course, and went off and said, can it be true that it's the same in 99% of the instances? We've had very few problems, but you go through things like that sometimes, very high transaction costs.
Oh, thank you very much. Now, Dr. Michael, if you are given a transaction personally that is Sharia compliance and also conventionally accepted, which one would you personally choose?
Depends on the circumstance. I'm kind of indifferent. I probably would choose the Sharia compliant one because it attracts a bigger audience.
Mm.
If it's not Sharia compliant, Muslims can't invest in it and can't participate in it. If I think the risk allocation can be essentially the same so that the investor group will be interested, I'd always pick the Sharia compliant one. I have a set of slides. I do a lot of project financing of big power plants and stuff like that. Mines, road systems. I did, as an exercise, I took a transaction that wasn't particularly difficult and did my standard, the associates that work for me always joke because I walk around with one piece of paper in a deal. It's my picture, diagram of the deal. And the joke is, can you make a comment or something that gets me to change something on my diagram? I made a diagram of this same transaction, Sharia compliant and conventional, to prove to people, because they always say, oh, it's more complex to do Sharia compliant stuff. To prove to people the complexity is about half. And it's not the Sharia compliant one that's the more complex. A Sharia compliant one is less complex. There aren't as many trusts. There aren't, so there are a lot of instances where I'd rather use that just because it's simpler. I'm an old guy. I'm over 70. So, once you get to this age, you want things simpler all the time.
Absolutely. I agree. I fully agree. Okay. Now, another question. How do you deal with the issue of bankers not knowing what to do or the problem of lack of ethics which affected Islamic banks negatively?
Ethics, tough situation, begins in childhood. Ethics, in my view, aren't related to ethnicity or even religion. It's ethical training. I don't mean to skirt the question, but I think it's too late to begin with somebody. Certainly we have to have it, but somebody coming out of business school or law school or whatever, it's too late. If they're a corrupt human being, you might scare them into not, being unethical. But I don't even know about that. I don't mean to be too cynical, but I think you begin with kids. And you teach people to respect each other and to behave in an ethical manner. Now, that said, we have a lot of ethical rules. Look, I'm a member of the New York Bar as a lawyer. The Code of Professional Responsibility, the ethics code, is part of the law. It's not just some, hey, this is a nicety, you guys should be, complying with this. And it doesn't mean that everybody complies. But in many instances, it's a crime. It's not just an ethical violation, it's a crime to not comply. That's fine with me. You're going to have penalties.
Fine. What is your view on fatwa shopping?
Well,
I think you touched a little bit on this. But...
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic to me, fatwa shopping. Look, you had a period of hundreds of years where there were very few people that studied the Sharia as applied to commerce and finance. So in the 70s, when the banks began, there just weren't very many scholars who were knowledgeable. So yeah, there was a small number of people and they're on every board. And it takes a long, long time to train a Sharia scholar. Look, I've studied the Sharia since 1996. So how many years is that?
25 years.
25 years. I know nothing about it. And
agree.
It takes a long time to train a Sharia scholar. And as many Sharia scholars have told me, it takes a lot of experience and that you nurse them along. Look, there was a young man, I was very fortunate. I lived in Saudi from 96 to 2000. So when I began this, I began in 96. And I happened to be taught by some pretty prominent Sharia scholars because they would come to Saudi, I lived in Jeddah most of the time. And they would come through there to go to Mecca, Medina, and Dr. Algari lived there. And I knew him quite well from local banks. So I've known Sharia scholars, and I've been very fortunate to get, trained by the best Sharia scholars there are in this world. At one point, and I form a lot of Sharia boards for my clients. When we're going to do a fund or something, we appoint a Sharia board. So I approach different scholars. Let me ask you this to the person who asked that question. If I'm going to sell this, my client is going to sell the product in identifiable jurisdictions. Let's say Saudi and Southeast Asia and Turkey. Am I going to shop for scholars who are Shafi or Hanbali or whatever? Yes, I am. Because that's the population that's being served, and that's the interpretation of the people who live there. So there's some Sharia scholar shopping that is just, of course, it's natural. Secondly, in my view, there are three tiers of Sharia scholars. There are internationalists, there are regionalists, and there are local. And most of the boards, you want to have representatives from everybody. You also want the ultimate decision, if I'm representing a fund, is not ours because it's not our money. We're going out and asking people for money. So the ultimate decision is the person who's putting the money in, whether they believe this is Sharia compliant. So am I going to appoint somebody to my board that knows from that investor's point of view? Let's say they're Maliki. Yeah, I'm going to pick a scholar that knows that point of view to advise me because I don't want to spend $2 million developing a product that's ultimately somebody says that doesn't work. We did that. In the early 90s, we were not terribly sophisticated we develop products without adequate representation from other jurisdictions. We go to that jurisdiction to sell. And the scholars would say, well, it doesn't work here. It may work for you in Saudi, but it doesn't work out here. Well, then we got to start over and we squandered a lot of money. We learned pretty quickly there are some advantages to the limited number of scholars. I think these are among the most ethical people I've ever met in my life, Sharia scholars. It's just beyond imagination, pure, in my experience of 25 years of doing this. One of the problems we have, there's so few, they know everything that goes on. And they are on the board of somebody. I'm developing a product for one of my clients. I go and say, does this work? And they say, no, it doesn't work. And I say, how do I fix it? And they can't always tell me how to fix it because they may be representing on a board that's representing somebody that's developing a similar product. They can't violate that confidentiality and tell me how to fix it because it's information from a competitor. So sometimes I think people don't appreciate the difficulty of their position. So then and I've been doing this long enough now that I know how to start asking questions.
Yes.
To whittle that down a little bit. But I have never seen a Sharia scholar betray the confidence of another institution.
Wow.
Now, as we get more and more scholars, so I think there's good and bad to Sharia scholar shopping. I think there's less of it than people think. I don't think any scholar that I'm aware of is unethical enough that they would be bought the way you see it in the press, that, scholar shopping. It's not that at all. It's a much more nuanced, difficult problem than that. Do I think there are conflicts of interest all over the place? Yes, I do. From a lawyer's point of view, it would never be tolerated. But we don't have a lot of choice. How many scholars are there? In some way. So you have to rely on their integrity and their ethics as you build this out. And that's going to take a generation or more.
Very good. Another question, a little bit technical. Can you talk about Sharia compliant commercial lending and how you see that market evolving? Commercial lending.
There's a lot of it in the US. I mean, we take our capita example that or East Cameron. Those are big commercial financings. I wouldn't call them lending. They're financings. Lending to me bears interest. So if you don't mind, I'll call them financings. There's a lot of it. We do working capital facilities all the time. I've done Murabaha facilities that are not metals. They're not what I call vectors. A vector Murabaha to me is a lot of people call a commodity Murabaha. I think that's unfortunate. There are true commodity Murabahas. So if I represent a big international trading company and we're buying Argentinian beef and New Zealand lamb and vegetables from Chile, and they're all going to supermarkets and wholesale grocery chains in the Middle East, a lot of those are Murabaha, true commodity Murabaha transactions. They never make the press. Big corporates don't advertise their involvements with their clients on the whole. So you have no clue how much of that goes on. There's a lot of it. There's a lot of it in the United States. All of our funds have to be totally Sharia compliant, meaning every bit of rent that comes in every month goes into accounts and has to be invested in a Sharia compliant manner. The reserve funds have to be invested in a Sharia compliant manner. Well, we have to do all that through the banking system. So there's a lot of it. Not advertised, but
okay. Well, there is another question here. I think this will be the last, although we have many others, but I apologize for the time. So, Dr. Michael, the last question, it was actually mentioned also. Many people don't differentiate or don't know the differences between riba and interest, because the word riba is mentioned in the Quran, but interest as an interest is not mentioned. So are we handling it properly? If then another kind of question. If I lend a friend money in different currency, should he return it in his local currency or the one I gave him?
Let me do the first question. The debate on riba is extensive. It's scholarly. The debate in Islamic finance is zero. If it's interest, it's riba. They're the same. For the industry, for the practice of Islamic finance, there just is no interest. Mohammed Fadl up at McGill has written some interesting papers, as have many others, on the different types of riba. That's academic stuff. In the practical world, there is zero. On your money question, I can't answer the question. You're going to have to talk to a Sharia scholar.
Most knowledgeable people say, I don't know. And that's the best answer. And may Allah bless you. This has been very, very enriching indeed, not only on the theoretical, philosophical, but also on the practical level. May God bless all of you and all the listeners, all the questioners. And again, I apologize for those who questioned us, but we have no time, and time is important. And that's why I think I will end up with saying, wal asri, because it means time. إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. May Allah make us all among them. And thank you again, Dr. Michael McMillen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Thank you all very much.